All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today we're tackling a massive, centuries-old pursuit, global poverty reduction. We're going to break down the history, the core mechanisms, and some of the highly debated modern strategies being used right now to try and level the economic playing field across the globe. It's a colossal topic, and frankly, it touches every single one of our lives because it shapes the very foundation of how our societies function and ultimately how we define fairness in the modern world.
Here's our roadmap for today. 1. The roots of economic justice. 2. Building social protection systems. 3. The case for cash. 4. Housing and fair wages. And 5. A fair economic future.
Section 1. Roots of economic justice, a historical pursuit.
It's wild to think about, but we are standing on a seriously long historical foundation when we talk about economic justice. You can jump all the way back to 1797 with Thomas Paine. In his pamphlet, Agrarian Justice, he was already making these early arguments for a national fund and pensions to support the elderly and the vulnerable. Fast forward over a century and we see the massive federal interventions of the 1930s. FDR's New Deal and the creation of Social Security completely reshaped what the government's role in citizen welfare actually looks like. And that momentum, it just kept building right up to the 1960s, where LBJ launched the War on Poverty, and Martin Luther King Jr.'s Poor People's Campaign framed poverty not just as an economic issue, but as a national moral failure demanding a baseline of economic dignity for absolutely everyone.
Think about this quote for a second. During his 1944 State of the Union address, Franklin D. Roosevelt proposed a Second Bill of Rights, and the underlying philosophy there was simple but incredibly profound. True individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence. The core argument is that you can't be truly free if you're starving, if you're unhoused, or if you're just constantly terrified of financial ruin. That concept, that physical and economic survival is a literal prerequisite for liberty, remains the absolute bedrock of modern economic justice efforts today.
Section 2. Building social protection systems, the global safety net.
So, shifting to the present day, when big organizations like the UN, the International Labor Organization, or the World Bank talk about social protection, what do they actually mean? Well, they're talking about the essential, life-saving systems that help households withstand sudden shocks. We mean policies and programs actively designed to reduce poverty and vulnerability throughout the entire human life cycle. We're talking vital benefits for children, the elderly, the unemployed. It's the structural safety net consciously designed by societies to catch people before they fall into extreme crisis or generational poverty.
To really wrap our heads around the colossal scale of this ongoing challenge, just consider this single number: 1.4 billion. Recent data from UNICEF and the ILO report that 1.4 billion children globally are completely missing out on basic social protection. That means hundreds of millions of kids are living every single day without a safety net, leaving them incredibly vulnerable to severe deprivation in fundamental areas like food security, basic healthcare, and education. The stakes of building these systems literally couldn't be higher.
Now, modern social protection, it is absolutely not a one-size-fits-all deal. It has to be highly adaptable. As the World Bank outlines, modern interventions have to be carefully tailored to the specific crisis a region is facing. In Ukraine, for example, the primary focus right now is just keeping basic benefits flowing to citizens during wartime and focusing on recovery. Meanwhile, over in Zambia, the strategy shifts toward building adaptive resilience, so local communities can actually survive escalating climate disasters. And in Kenya, the focus is on a massive project aiming to empower 12 million people by directly connecting them to jobs and economic inclusion.
Moving on to Section 3, the case for cash, direct income support.
This brings us to a really intense debate happening right now in economic circles, beautifully outlined by research from places like the Harvard Kennedy School and the Michigan Journal of Economics. On one hand, you have means-tested basic income. These programs target those who need it most based on strict income limits. Now, that naturally keeps overall government costs down, but it creates complex bureaucratic hurdles that can accidentally lock out the exact people who need the help the most. On the exact opposite end, you have Universal Basic Income, or UBI. This provides broad cash payments to everyone. It's incredibly simple to administer, but critics are quick to point out the giant price tags and the major political hurdles of giving public money to people who are already wealthy.
But what happens when we actually put unconditional cash into practice? We can clearly see the tangible human impact when we look at programs like RX Kids in Flint, Michigan. This initiative provided unconditional cash transfers to expectant mothers and families with infants.
And you know what researchers found? Giving direct cash support clearly reduced family stress and resulted in a measurable decline in infant maltreatment allegations. It's an incredibly powerful data point, suggesting that establishing baseline economic stability directly and immediately improves child welfare outcomes. And when you zoom out and apply this direct cash concept at a full national level, the data is honestly striking. Based on reporting from the U.S. Census Bureau and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, let's look at the year 2021. An expanded child tax credit provided direct monthly cash to American families. The result of that single policy was a monumental drop in child poverty to a record low of 5.2%. But when that exact same policy expired in 2022, those historic gains reversed sharply, and poverty spiked right back up. It's a clear, real-world example of how direct policy choices act as a literal dial on national poverty levels.
Section 4. Housing and fair wages. Grounding economic theories. Because here's the thing. All the social safety nets in the world just can't compensate for a labor market that doesn't pay enough to cover basic rent. Addressing the current housing affordability crisis requires a deeply multifaceted approach. As the Urban Institute and the CBP point out, just increasing overall housing supply, while important, cannot immediately help a family who is facing eviction right this second. To solve the crisis, communities also need to expand targeted rental assistance to keep low-income households housed today. And finally, affordable housing must be actively connected to real opportunity, meaning reliable public transit and high-quality schools. You really need all of these elements working together to actually drive upward economic mobility.
Coupled inextricably with housing is, of course, the issue of fair wages. The Economic Policy Institute actually considers the current U.S. federal minimum wage to be quite literally a poverty wage, because it has vastly lost its purchasing power over the decades. They calculate that gradually raising it to $15 an hour would lift the pay of a gargantuan 32 million workers. Let that sink in. For anti-poverty advocates and economists looking at the data, raising this wage floor isn't just some minor policy tweak. It's seen as a foundational step to achieving basic economic fairness.
And finally, Section 5. A fairer economic future, looking ahead.
So stepping back, how are global organizations actively envisioning the future of economic justice in the face of escalating challenges like climate change, AI, and historic wealth gaps? Well, UN experts and researchers at the World Inequality Lab argue that traditional growth-centered economics has essentially failed to eliminate global poverty, while simultaneously worsening our ecological crises. Because of this, they're proposing some bold alternatives for a redistributive economy. They're talking about implementing progressive wealth taxes to address extreme inequality, establishing universal job guarantees for anyone willing to work, executing massive debt cancellation for struggling developing nations, and perhaps most fundamentally, they want to shift our primary measurement of success entirely away from raw GDP growth and redirect it toward the actual fulfillment of basic human needs.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a really provocative thought. When we look at the centuries of historical pursuit, the modern data on cash transfers, and the pressing realities of the housing crisis, how do we actually solve this colossal challenge moving forward? Is true economic justice achieved by simply raising the floor of our current system to protect the most vulnerable? Or, as those UN experts suggest, do we need to fundamentally restructure the entire global economy? It's a complex debate that will undoubtedly define our global future. Thanks for diving into the data with me today.